Father Marcus had seen everything in his 37 years of life and 15 years serving God. Drug addicts seeking redemption, their hands shaking as they confessed to stealing from their own children. Broken families begging for miracles, their eyes hollow with the weight of dreams that had crumbled like autumn leaves. Wealthy sinners buying their way into heaven with generous donations, believing money could cleanse souls the way it cleaned everything else in their privileged lives. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared him for what he discovered that rainy Thursday evening when he found a homeless woman kneeling in his empty church, whispering prayers that would shatter everything he believed about faith, love, and the very nature of divine justice. The storm that night had been brewing for days, dark clouds gathering over Boston like an omen of the revelation that was about to unfold. Lightning split the sky in jagged wounds, and thunder rolled across the city with the voice of judgment itself. It was the kind of weather that made people question whether God was angry, whether the heavens were weeping for sins too numerous to count. It was 9:15 when I locked the heavy oak doors of St. Augustine Cathedral, the ancient brass key turning with a click that echoed through the stone corridors like a final prayer. The rain hammered against the stained glass windows with relentless fury, each drop a reminder that October in Boston could be merciless to both body and soul. The colored glass depicted scenes of salvation and sacrifice, but tonight they looked more like windows into some darker realm where angels wrestled with demons in eternal combat. I had just finished evening mass for the handful of faithful who braved the storm, mostly elderly parishioners clutching their worn prayer books like lifelines against the tide of doubt that threatened to drown them all. Mrs. O'Brien had stayed after to light a candle for her deceased husband, her arthritis-gnarled fingers trembling as she whispered prayers she had repeated every Thursday for the past 3 years. Mr. Kozlov had knelt in his usual pew, the same spot where he had prayed every evening since his son died in Afghanistan, his tears mingling with the rain that somehow seemed to seep through even these sacred walls. The cathedral felt different after everyone left, more alive somehow, as if the stones themselves absorbed the prayers and held them like precious secrets. After 15 years of ministry, I had learned to feel the spiritual temperature of a place, to sense when God felt close or distant, when peace settled over a sanctuary, or when something darker stirred in the shadows between the pews. As I walked toward my quarters, my footsteps echoing off the marble floors that had been polished by countless generations of faithful souls, something made me pause, a sound, barely audible above the rain and wind. Soft murmuring coming from the main sanctuary, like the whisper of ghosts or the echo of prayers that had been spoken in this place for over a century. My heart skipped a beat, then began to pound with a rhythm that seemed too loud in the sacred silence. I was certain I had locked every entrance, checked every corner, followed the security protocol that had been drilled into me since my first assignment. No one should have been inside. No one could have been inside. I crept back through the shadows, my footsteps muffled by the thick carpet that had been donated by a wealthy parishioner who wanted his family name remembered in the very fibers beneath our feet. The murmuring grew clearer as I approached the altar, each word becoming more distinct even as its meaning remained mysterious. There, beneath the massive crucifix that had been carved from a single piece of oak by Italian artisans 2 centuries ago, knelt a figure draped in tattered clothes that might once have been a coat, but now looked more like a shroud. A woman, thin as a ghost, her matted hair falling like curtains around her face. Her skin had the weathered quality of someone who had lived under open skies for too long, lined with stories of hardship that would take lifetimes to fully understand. Her lips moved in constant prayer, words flowing like water from a broken dam, each syllable carrying the weight of years of accumulated sorrow and desperate hope. For a moment, I stood frozen, uncertain whether I was witnessing a miracle or a break-in, but as I listened closer to her words, my blood turned to ice. She wasn't reciting the Our Father or Hail Mary. She was speaking names, dozens of names, and with each name she whispered the same haunting phrase, "Forgive me, I failed you." I stepped forward, and the floorboard creaked beneath my weight. The woman's head snapped up, her eyes meeting mine across the dim sanctuary. What I saw in those eyes will haunt me forever. They were the color of storm clouds, filled with a pain so deep it seemed to swallow light itself. She wasn't just homeless. She was broken in a way that went beyond poverty, beyond addiction, beyond anything I had encountered in my years of ministry. "Father," she whispered, her voice like autumn leaves scraping against concrete, carrying the rasp of too many nights spent sleeping rough under bridges and in doorways. "I've been waiting for you." I approached slowly, the way one might approach a wounded animal or a miracle that might disappear if disturbed too quickly. My seminary training had prepared me for many situations, but never for this strange combination of trespass and transcendence. "Sister, the church is closed. How did you get inside?" My training kicked in, pastoral care mixed with practical concern, but something about her presence made my usual questions feel as insignificant as dust motes in cathedral light. She smiled then, a broken expression that somehow held more grace than any saint's portrait I had ever seen hanging in the finest museums of religious art. Her teeth were crooked and stained, evidence of years without proper care, but her smile contained something that spoke of an inner beauty that poverty could not touch. "Locked doors have never kept me out when God calls me home," she said, her words carrying a certainty that made me question everything I thought I knew about the physical world and its limitations. I knelt beside her, close enough to smell the rain in her clothes and something else beneath it, something that reminded me of hospital corridors and the antiseptic scent of grief that clings to places where people go to die. Close enough to see that her eyes, though aged by suffering, still held the spark of someone who had once been beautiful, who had once commanded respect and inspired faith in others. "What's your name?" "Sister Mary Catherine," she said, then laughed, a sound like bells cracking under the weight of too much sorrow. "Though I haven't been a sister for 23 years, not since the fire." She paused, her fingers worrying at the fabric of her worn coat. "Not since I learned that some sins are too great for forgiveness, some failures too complete for redemption." The fire. Something about those words sent a chill through my entire body that had nothing to do with the October cold seeping through the cathedral's ancient stones. I had heard whispers, rumors from the older priests about a tragedy decades ago, a convent fire that had claimed multiple lives, lives lost under circumstances that were never fully explained to the public, a scandal covered up by layers of bureaucracy and institutional protection, children who had died while adults failed to protect them. But those were just stories, weren't they? Cautionary tales told in seminary to warn young priests about the dangers of pride and misplaced priorities. "Tell me about the fire," I found myself saying, though every instinct warned me I wasn't ready for her answer. Her eyes closed, and when she spoke again her voice transformed. No longer the rasp of homelessness, but the clear tones of someone who had once led children in prayer. Sacred Heart Convent, September 15th, 1999. 42 children in our care. I was the Mother Superior then, responsible for their souls, their safety, their very lives. My hands began to tremble. Sacred Heart Convent. I knew that name. Every priest in the archdiocese knew that name, though it was spoken only in whispers, if at all. The fire that killed 14 children and 3 nuns. The investigation that found negligence. The cover-up that destroyed careers and shattered faith across the entire region. "You're her," I breathed. "You're the one who failed them all," she finished, her voice steady now, as if she had practiced these words for decades. "Who chose to save the church records instead of checking the dormitories one more time? Who believed that preserving the institution was more important than protecting the innocent?" The weight of her confession settled over us like a burial shroud. Here, kneeling before me, was the woman whose story had been whispered in seminary halls as a cautionary tale about the dangers of pride and misplaced priorities. But those whispers had painted her as a monster. This woman, this broken soul, seeking forgiveness in an empty church, was anything but monstrous. "I've been searching for you," she continued, her eyes fixed on the crucifix above us. "For 15 years I've walked from church to church, carrying their names, begging God to tell me why I'm still alive when they are not. And tonight, he finally answered. I wanted to speak, to offer comfort or counsel, but her words had stolen my voice. Instead, I simply waited, sensing that this conversation would change everything I thought I understood about justice, forgiveness, and the mysterious ways of divine providence. She reached into her coat and pulled out a small weathered notebook. The leather cover was cracked with age and water damage, but she held it like it was the most precious thing in the world. "Their names," she whispered. "Every single child we lost. I've memorized them all, but I carry this to make sure I never forget a single syllable. She opened the notebook, and I saw pages covered in careful handwriting, names, ages, brief descriptions. Timothy Morrison, 7 years old. He wanted to be a priest like you someday. Maria Santos, 9. She painted the most beautiful angels I've ever seen. David Chen, 6. He had just learned to read and wanted to read the Bible all by himself. As she spoke each name, she traced the letters with her finger, a ritual of remembrance that had clearly been repeated thousands of times. The pain in her voice grew with each child remembered, but so did something else. Love. Pure, unconditional love for souls she had failed to protect. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She looked up from the notebook, and for the first time since I had discovered her, she smiled with something approaching peace. "Because tomorrow is September 15th, the 24th anniversary, and I finally understand what God wants me to do." A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the rain outside. "What do you mean?" "I've spent 24 years running from that night, punishing myself with homelessness, with isolation, with the constant reminder of my failures. But tonight, kneeling in this sanctuary, I realized something. God didn't keep me alive to suffer. He kept me alive to serve." She closed the notebook and pressed it to her heart. "Those children, they've been waiting for someone to tell their stories properly. Not the sanitized version the church released, not the tragedy the newspapers sensationalized, but their real stories, who they were, what they dreamed about, how they laughed, what made them special." I felt something shift in the air around us, as if the very atmosphere was responding to her words. "What are you planning to do?" "I'm going to give them the memorial they deserved. Tomorrow, on the anniversary, I'm going to stand before the cathedral and read every single name. I'm going to tell their stories to anyone who will listen. And then, Father Marcus, I'm going to ask God to finally let me join them." The finality in her voice terrified me. "Sister, you're talking about going home," she interrupted gently. "About finally being with the children I failed to protect in life." I reached out and took her hands in mine, feeling the calluses and scars of 2 decades living on the streets. "That's not what God wants from you. That's not justice. That's just more tragedy." She squeezed my hands with surprising strength. "How do you know what God wants, Father? Have you ever failed so completely that you questioned whether you deserved to draw another breath? Have you ever been responsible for the deaths of innocents?" Her questions hit me like physical blows. I thought of my comfortable rectory, my predictable routine, my neat theology that explained everything in tidy categories. How could I possibly understand the weight she carried? "I haven't," I admitted. "But I know that God doesn't call us to despair. He calls us to redemption." "Redemption," she repeated, tasting the word like bitter medicine. "I've prayed for redemption every day for 24 years. I've begged, I've bargained, I've screamed at the heavens until my voice gave out. And do you know what I've learned, Father?" I shook my head, afraid to hear her answer. "Sometimes redemption looks different than we expect. Sometimes it means accepting that our punishment is to keep living, to keep carrying the weight, to keep serving even when we feel unworthy of grace." She stood then, moving with a grace that seemed impossible for someone who had lived so rough for so long. "I need to prepare for tomorrow. Will you help me?" Every fiber of my training told me to call the authorities, to get her psychiatric help, to prevent whatever she was planning. But something in her eyes, something in the way the candlelight seemed to gather around her like a benediction, made me pause. "How can I help?" "Let me use your church tomorrow. Let me honor their memory properly. And when I'm finished, when I've told the world who they really were, pray for my soul as I go to meet them." I stood as well, my legs unsteady beneath me. "I can't let you hurt yourself. I won't be party to suicide." "Not suicide, Father. Surrender. There's a difference." She moved toward the side chapel where dozens of prayer candles flickered in red glass holders. "I've been fighting death for 24 years, clinging to life out of guilt rather than purpose. Tomorrow, I stop fighting. I let go. I trust that God knows what He's doing even when I don't understand." She lit another candle, the flame dancing as if alive. "Will you hear my confession?" The request caught me completely off guard. "Of course, but—" "No buts, Father. Just the sacrament. Let me unburden my soul properly, the way I should have done 24 years ago instead of running away." I retrieved my stole from the vestry, my hands shaking as I placed it around my shoulders. When I returned, she was kneeling in the confessional, her silhouette barely visible through the screen. "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned. It has been 24 years since my last confession." What followed was the most harrowing hour of my priesthood, a journey into the depths of human suffering that no seminary training could have prepared me for. She didn't just confess to negligence or poor judgment, the kind of administrative failures that plagued many religious institutions. She confessed to years of pride that had blinded her to the humanity of those under her care. She confessed to believing she knew better than God, to choosing institutional preservation over human life, to making calculations about property values and legal liability while children slept in beds she was supposed to protect. She confessed to the anger she felt toward God for allowing the fire to happen, anger so fierce it had burned in her chest like a second fire for 24 years. She described nights when she had screamed at the sky until her voice gave out, demanding answers from a God who seemed to have turned his face away from her and the children she had failed. She confessed to the hatred she felt for herself, a loathing so complete that she had deliberately sought out the most dangerous streets, the most hostile environments, secretly hoping that someone would put her out of her misery. But she also confessed to the temptation to end her own life that had plagued her for decades, the constant whisper that told her she deserved to die for what she had done. She spoke of standing on bridge ledges, of accumulating pills, of walking into traffic, and being saved only by the quick reflexes of strangers who had no idea they were rescuing someone who didn't want to be rescued. "I confess to something else," she said, her voice growing softer as she reached the most painful truths. "To the dreams that visit me every night. Dreams where I can hear their voices calling for help, calling my name, asking me why I didn't come for them. Dreams where I arrive at the dormitory just in time to see the flames take the last of them. Dreams where they look at me with such disappointment that I wake up screaming." But most surprising of all, she confessed to the love she still felt for the children she had lost, and to the gratitude she felt for the life God had allowed her to live, even in suffering. She spoke of moments over the years when she had seen their faces in other children, had heard their laughter in playgrounds, had felt their presence in quiet moments of prayer. She described a love so powerful it had become a form of penance, a daily reminder of what had been lost and what might still be redeemed. "I confess that I have spent 24 years punishing myself instead of honoring their memory," she whispered through the confessional screen. "I thought suffering was the same as atonement, that if I hurt enough, if I lost enough, if I degraded myself enough, somehow it would balance the scales of justice. But tonight, kneeling in this sanctuary, I finally understand that my suffering has been an act of selfishness, not sacrifice. I absolve you of your sins," I said when she finished, though the words felt inadequate in the face of such profound confession. "Go in peace to love and serve the Lord." "Thank you, Father." Her voice carried a lightness I hadn't heard before. "Now will you help me prepare for tomorrow?" We spent the rest of the night in the rectory, planning what she called a memorial of truth. She showed me photographs she had carried for years, pictures of the children from before the fire, their smiling faces, their artwork, their handwritten prayers. Each image was a testament to lives cut short but not forgotten. "Timothy wanted to build churches when he grew up," she said, showing me a drawing the 7-year-old had made of a cathedral with wings. "He said regular churches were too heavy to fly up to heaven, so he was going to design ones that could." She shared story after story, each child's personality emerging through her memories like flowers blooming in a garden of grief. By dawn, I understood that this wasn't the desperate act of a woman seeking death. This was the final ministry of someone who had found purpose in her pain. "There's something else," she said, as the first light crept through the rectory windows. "Something I've never told anyone, not even in confession tonight." I waited, sensing that this final revelation would be the most significant of all. The night of the fire, I wasn't in the convent because I was saving records. I was in the city, meeting with lawyers about selling the property. The archdiocese was pressuring us to close, and I was trying to find a way to save the convent by selling some of our land. The rooms seemed to grow smaller around us as the weight of her words settled in. I chose money over safety. I chose the institution over the children. I wasn't even there when they needed me most. I felt something break open in my chest, a combination of horror and compassion that left me gasping. "Sister, Mary Catherine," she corrected gently. I haven't been a sister for 24 years. Just Mary Catherine, the woman who failed the children God entrusted to her care. Mary Catherine, I said, using her name like a prayer. You can't carry this alone anymore. I know, she replied, her voice steady and calm. That's why God brought you to me. You're going to help me let go. The memorial service began at noon, exactly 24 years to the hour after the fire had started at Sacred Heart Convent. Word had spread somehow through the mysterious networks that connect the faithful in times of crisis, the way news always does in a religious community when something sacred is about to unfold. By the time we unlocked the cathedral doors, nearly 200 people had gathered outside in the drizzle that remained from the previous night's storm. Some came out of curiosity, drawn by rumors of the infamous Mother Superior who had finally emerged from hiding after more than 2 decades of exile. Local news crews had somehow gotten wind of the event, their cameras capturing every face that entered the cathedral, hungry for a story that would fill the evening broadcasts with drama and redemption. Others came seeking closure, family members and friends who had lost children in the fire, people who had carried their grief like physical wounds for 24 years, never quite healing, never quite hopeful that answers might still come. But most came because they sensed they were about to witness something sacred, something that transcended ordinary grief and entered the realm of divine mystery. There was an electricity in the air, the kind of spiritual tension that builds before moments when heaven touches earth in unmistakable ways. Old women clutched rosaries with arthritic fingers. Young mothers held their children closer, and grown men who hadn't set foot in a church for years found themselves drawn by something they couldn't name but couldn't resist. Mary Catherine stood at the altar, no longer the broken vagrant I had found the night before. She wore a simple white dress I had borrowed from the parish clothing drive, and someone from the congregation had helped her wash and braid her hair with hands that remembered skills from decades past. But the real transformation was in her bearing, in the way she stood like someone who had finally found peace with an impossible burden. The morning light streaming through the stained glass windows seemed to gather around her like a benediction, and more than one person in the congregation would later swear they saw something like a halo forming above her head. My name is Mary Catherine Rodriguez, she began, her voice carrying clearly through the packed cathedral with a strength that seemed impossible for someone so frail. 24 years ago, I was the Mother Superior of Sacred Heart Convent. 14 children died in a fire while I was away from the building, and I have spent every day since then trying to understand why God allowed such a tragedy to occur, and why He kept me alive to carry the weight of their loss. A murmur ran through the congregation like wind through wheat, but she raised her hand for silence with the natural authority of someone who had once led others in prayer and service. Today, I want to tell you about those children, not about how they died, because their deaths have been discussed and analyzed and sensationalized enough to fill libraries. Today I want to tell you about how they lived, about the dreams they carried in their young hearts, the prayers they whispered when they thought no one was listening, the love they shared with everyone around them, the ways they made our little corner of the world brighter simply by being in it. For the next 2 hours, she spoke about each child individually. She told Timothy's story about wanting to build flying churches. She described Maria's paintings of angels with her grandmother's face. She shared David's excitement about reading his first Bible verse by himself. As she spoke, something remarkable happened. The grief in the room began to transform into something else. Not healing exactly, but acknowledgement, recognition. These children were being remembered not as victims, but as unique souls who had brought joy and wonder into the world during their brief time here. Family members in the congregation began to weep, but they were tears of gratitude rather than just sorrow. To hear their children remembered with such love, such detail, such reverence, was a gift they had never expected to receive. And now, Mary Catherine said as she reached the end of her litany of names, I want to share with you what these children taught me about the nature of God's love. She paused, looking out over the sea of faces, and I could see the final transformation taking place in her eyes. The last vestiges of guilt were being replaced by something infinitely more powerful, understanding. These children didn't die because God stopped loving them. They didn't die because I failed them, though I did fail them. They died because we live in a world where tragedy exists alongside beauty, where loss walks hand in hand with love, where even the most faithful among us must sometimes endure the unthinkable. Her voice grew stronger with each word, carrying a conviction that seemed to lift the entire congregation. For 24 years I believed that my survival was a punishment, that I was condemned to suffer for my failures. But standing here now, looking into your faces, remembering these beautiful children with you, I finally understand. I survived not to be punished, but to ensure that they would never be forgotten. I survived to tell their stories, to honor their lives, to carry their memory forward until the day I could finally deliver it into hands more capable than mine. She looked directly at me then, and I understood what she was asking. I stood and joined her at the altar, my legs somehow steady despite the magnitude of what was happening. Father Marcus has agreed to establish a permanent memorial fund in honor of these 14 children, she announced. Their stories will be preserved, their artwork will be displayed, and their memory will inspire future generations to protect the innocent with more wisdom and courage than I possessed. The applause that followed was not the polite clapping of a church service, but the thunderous acknowledgement of a community that had just witnessed something transformative. People were standing, crying, embracing one another, as if they had all been waiting for this moment without knowing it. But Mary Catherine wasn't finished. She raised her hands once more, and the cathedral fell silent. There is one more thing I need to share with you. One more truth that has taken me 24 years to accept. She took a deep breath, and when she spoke again, her voice carried the authority of someone who had looked directly into the heart of divine mystery and lived to tell about it. God forgave me before I ever asked for forgiveness. Grace was there waiting for me every single day of these 24 years. I was the one who couldn't accept it. I was the one who chose punishment over redemption, guilt over grace, isolation over love. Tears streamed down her face, but she was smiling now with a radiance that seemed to illuminate the entire sanctuary. Today, I finally choose grace. I choose to believe that God can use even our deepest failures for His purposes. I choose to trust that these beautiful children are exactly where they belong, and that my job now is not to join them in death, but to honor them in life. The silence that followed was profound, the kind of holy quiet that descends when heaven touches earth in unmistakable ways. Then, spontaneously, someone in the congregation began to sing. It was an old hymn, Amazing Grace, but sung with a conviction that made the familiar words sound newly minted. As the entire cathedral joined in, Mary Catherine closed her eyes and let the music wash over her. When the last note faded, she opened them and looked directly at me. Father, I'm ready to begin again. 3 months later, the Sacred Heart Children's Memorial Garden was dedicated on the site where the old convent had stood. The ground that had once been marked by tragedy now transformed into a living testament to the power of redemption. The ceremony was attended by hundreds of people, including many who had never known the children personally, but had been moved by Mary Catherine's story of loss and recovery. Sister Mary Catherine, now officially reinstated by Bishop Sullivan after months of theological review and pastoral counseling, served as the garden's first director. The process of her reinstatement had been controversial within the archdiocese, with some officials arguing that her failures were too severe to overlook, while others contended that grace demanded a second chance for someone who had suffered so profoundly for her mistakes. The memorial wasn't a monument to tragedy, but a celebration of life in all its complexity and beauty. Each of the 14 children was honored with a unique garden space that reflected their individual personalities and dreams, as Mary Catherine remembered them. Timothy's section featured a small chapel with stained glass windows that caught the light like wings, fulfilling his childhood dream of building churches that could fly to heaven. The windows were crafted by local artisans who donated their time and materials, each pane telling a story of flight and freedom. Maria's area showcased local artists' interpretations of angelic themes, rotating exhibitions that kept her memory alive while inspiring new generations of creative expression. The space included easels where children could paint their own angels, their artwork displayed alongside professional pieces in a democracy of imagination that would have delighted the young girl who had once covered the convent walls with her drawings. David's Corner housed a little free library filled with children's books and Bibles, the shelves carved with quotes from his favorite stories, and painted in the bright colors he had loved so much. Children would come to read under the shade of apple trees planted in his honor, their laughter mixing with the sound of wind through leaves in a symphony that spoke of life continuing even after loss. But perhaps the most powerful element of the memorial was the storytelling pavilion, where Sister Mary Catherine held weekly gatherings every Thursday evening. Children and adults would come to hear her tell stories about the children who had died, but also to share stories of their own loved ones who had passed. She had discovered that her gift wasn't just for remembering the dead, but for helping others find meaning in their own experiences of loss, for teaching them that grief could be transformed into love rather than bitterness. The pavilion was built in a circle, symbolizing the eternal nature of love and memory, with benches arranged so that every person could see every other person's face. At the center stood a fountain carved with the names of all 14 children, water flowing continuously, and a reminder that life, like love, never truly ends but simply changes form. I visited the garden regularly during those early months, always amazed by the transformation I witnessed, not just in the physical space, but in the people who came there. Sister Mary Catherine moved through the memorial like someone who had found her true calling, tending not just to the flowers and trees, but to the wounded souls who came seeking comfort, understanding, and hope. "You know what I've learned, Father," she told me one autumn afternoon as we walked among the memorial plantings. "God doesn't waste anything. Not our failures, not our pain, not even our years of running from His love. He just waits for us to be ready to let Him transform it all into something beautiful." She paused by Timothy's chapel, where afternoon light was streaming through the colored glass like liquid jewels. Those children didn't die for nothing. Their deaths led to new safety regulations that have saved countless other children. Their memory inspired this garden that brings healing to hundreds of grieving families. And my 24 years of wandering taught me compassion for the lost and broken in ways I never could have learned from textbooks. "Do you think they know?" I asked. "Do you think they understand what their lives and deaths accomplished?" She smiled, the same radiant expression I had first seen in the cathedral that night when she chose grace over despair. "I know they do. Sometimes when the light hits Timothy's chapel just right, I swear I can see him grinning at me through the glass. And when the wind moves through Maria's angel garden, I hear their laughter mixed with the rustling leaves." She touched my arm gently, her eyes bright with tears that held no sadness. "That's what I've learned about faith, Father. It's not about avoiding tragedy or understanding God's plan. It's about trusting that love is stronger than loss, that grace is deeper than guilt, and that every single soul has a purpose that extends beyond what we can see." As the sun set behind us, painting the memorial garden in shades of gold and amber, I understood that I had witnessed something far more profound than a woman finding peace with her past. I had seen the very nature of divine redemption played out in human terms, watched grace triumph over guilt in ways that no theology textbook could adequately describe. The homeless woman who had stumbled into my church seeking forgiveness had become a sister again, but more than that, she had become a living testament to the possibility of transformation. Her story reminded everyone who heard it that no failure is final, no guilt is permanent, and no soul is beyond the reach of love. That night, as I knelt in my own prayers, I thanked God for the privilege of witnessing such a powerful demonstration of His grace, and I prayed for the wisdom to remember Mary Catherine's lesson whenever I encountered others who felt beyond redemption, trapped by their own failures and guilt. Sometimes the most profound truths come not from scripture or theology, but from broken people who have discovered that God specializes in making beautiful things out of shattered lives. Sister Mary Catherine taught me that the question isn't whether we deserve forgiveness, but whether we're brave enough to accept it when it's offered. And in accepting that grace, we don't just find peace for ourselves. We become instruments of healing for others who are still wandering in the wilderness of their own guilt and shame, still believing that they are beyond the reach of love. The Sacred Heart Children's Memorial Garden still welcomes visitors every day, and Sister Mary Catherine still shares her story with anyone who needs to hear it. Because some testimonies are too powerful to keep quiet, and some demonstrations of grace are too important to let fade into memory. If you found meaning in this story of redemption and second chances, please share it with others who might need to hear that no failure is final and no soul is beyond the reach of love. And remember that sometimes the most broken among us carry the most powerful messages about the nature of divine grace.